The wind came first, thin, cold, carrying the sound of something breathing where no breath should be. Ranger Eli Hart froze halfway through his patrol notes, eyes drawn to the tree-line. A shape moved there, slow and deliberate, as if carved out of dusk itself. He stepped closer, heart drumming once, twice. Then he saw it, a massive brown bear standing at the edge of the clearing, and in her mouth, something small, limp, and terribly still. She didn't growl. She didn't flee. She just looked at him and waited. Eli stood still. The cabin door cracked just enough to let the morning light catch the edges of the bear's fur. Her eyes, dark, heavy with unspoken history, locked on his. There was no rush, no sudden movement, just the weight of her presence, as if she'd been standing there for hours, waiting. The world had gone quiet, all the sounds of the forest swallowed by the tension hanging between them. The cub at her mouth barely moved. Its small body, limp and fragile, seemed impossibly still against the backdrop of such raw, untamed life. The mother's eyes, though, held something unmistakable. Desperation, yes, but something else too. A kind of patience, as if she understood the silence of the woods in ways that only the wild could. Eli didn't know how long he had been watching, but in that moment, it felt as though time itself had paused. His instincts kicked in, a steady pulse of survival rules flooding his mind. Do not approach. Do not feed. Do not interfere. Call it in. Wait for help. But the words felt far away, and his hands trembled against the doorframe as he reached for the bolt. The cold air seeped in, rushing past him, and his mind raced. What do I do? What do I do? Every part of him screamed to shut the door, lock it, and wait for the biologist to arrive. He had always followed the rules. His job had always been clear, but this moment, it was different. This moment wasn't about rules. It wasn't even about the cub. It was about a mother, a creature who trusted no one, who had carried her baby all this way in silence, only to find him. What if she's asking for help? The thought pierced him. Slowly, cautiously, he moved toward the door, the sounds of his own footsteps muffled by the thick silence of the cabin. He didn't know what he was doing. He didn't even know what he expected to happen. But when his hand touched the door, the choice was made. He opened it. The bear didn't flinch, but there was a sudden tension in the way she sat, her body coiling like a spring, ready for anything. Her eyes, though, they never left his face. She seemed to know him, in a way, just as he knew her, and yet the distance between them had never felt wider. He stepped forward, one cautious boot at a time. His breath caught in his throat as the chill of the morning wrapped around him, biting deep. The cub lay on the step, its body pressed against the cold wood, its tiny chest rising and falling, each breath a desperate effort to stay alive. Eli's heart raced. I can't leave it out there. I can't. Every part of him screamed to go to the cub, to help it, but his eyes were still on the bear. She made no sound, her breath the only thing that filled the space between them. And then, without warning, she moved, just a step, but it was enough. A soft growl rumbled deep in her throat, a warning, or perhaps a plea. Eli's body froze, the weight of her gaze holding him in place. Every instinct in him told him to retreat, to take the safe route to wait. But his feet were already moving, driven by something deeper than fear, something that called to the man he had once been before all the rules, before the paperwork, before the park's cold, bureaucratic walls. Easy, he whispered to himself, his voice shaking as he took another step. The cold air cut through him like a blade, but he barely noticed. His focus was on the cub, its tiny body so fragile, so close to slipping away. As he knelt beside it, the weight of the moment pressed on him like the world itself was holding its breath. The mother's eyes never wavered, watching him as if to say, "This is your choice." He wasn't sure if he was saving the cub, or if he was saving something of himself. Eli's fingers trembled as he reached down, brushing the small cub's fur. It was cold, slick with blood, and so still that for a moment he feared the worst. The bear had done everything she could. Her eyes, those deep pools of wildness, seemed to say that she had fought for this tiny life, that she had already given everything. But Eli wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. The cub's chest rose and fell weakly, a small shudder passing through it. And in that breath, Eli felt something else. Hope. He shifted his jacket, wrapping the tiny creature as gently as he could, tucking it into the warmth of his arms. His mind raced, piecing together fragments of training, of past emergencies when he'd been called in to help animals that should have died in the wild. Animals that did die, despite the best efforts of men like him. But this was different. He had no radio signal, no backup. It was just him, this wild thing, and the choice that came with the raw weight of nature's demands. The mother remained still, watching him, but there was something in her gaze that felt less like a warning now and more like a silent agreement. Eli had made his choice, and she understood that. She had no reason to trust him, but trust was a currency he couldn't afford to lose. He took a deep breath and turned back toward the door, carrying the cub like a fragile bundle. The mother remained seated on the porch, her massive body a shadow against the growing light of dawn. Her breath hung in the cold air like smoke, a steady rhythm that mirrored his own, a quiet exchange between two creatures living on borrowed time. Inside, the warmth hid him like a blanket, though it was the smallest of comforts. He set the cub down on the kitchen table, clearing space around it as quickly as his trembling hands would allow. The room felt too small, suffocating under the weight of what he had just stepped into. The air smelled of coffee and pine, of the old wood of the cabin, smells that should have felt comforting, but right now, they only reminded him of everything he could lose. Eli's eyes flicked to the window, to the bear still watching him from the edge of the porch. She was an immovable presence, unwavering in her silent vigil. She'll wait. Eli knew that. Bears were patient. They knew how to outlast you, how to wait until the world bent to their will. He didn't know how long he had, how much time the cub had, but he couldn't afford to waste any of it. He snapped into action, pulling out his emergency first aid kit, a mismatched collection of bandages, scissors, and salves. He worked fast, his hands moving in a practiced rhythm, one task bleeding into the next. The cub's breathing was shallow, each exhale more fragile than the last. His mind clicked through procedures, but the words felt empty now. There was no protocol here. There was just him in a life that wasn't his to save, not really. But he had to try. As he cleaned the wound, the cub stirred again, letting out a weak sound that twisted in Eli's chest. It wasn't a cry, not a squeal, but something else entirely. It was the kind of sound that you only hear when something is lost, when something is given up, but is still trying to hold on. Eli's hands stilled as the weight of the moment pressed down on him. The world outside had gone still, waiting for him to either make the right choice or watch as everything fell apart. His mind flashed back to earlier when he'd seen the bear, so large, so raw, and yet so steady. She wasn't asking for help. She wasn't begging. She had simply come, and by coming, had already offered more than most people would in a lifetime. She had chosen trust. It was the same trust that was now slipping into his arms, a weight that could break him or teach him how to hold on. The cub's eyes fluttered open, unfocused but alive. Eli let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. He covered the wound with fresh gauze, his hand steady now as he worked. The bear outside was still. Her presence was a constant hum in the background of his thoughts, a reminder that no matter what happened in here, he had to get this right. He finished the bandages and took a step back, eyes flicking to the door. The mother had not moved, not even a twitch. Eli's chest tightened. She's trusting me. He pulled the small plastic bottle of antibiotics from his kit and drew the syringe carefully, his mind still flicking through memories of his training. The world outside seemed to pause as he slid the needle under the cub's skin, careful not to disturb the fragile body. The cub gave a small jerk, a soft whimper, but it didn't pull away. Eli didn't look at the needle as he worked. Instead, his eyes were on the small form of the cub, on its breath, on the way its tiny body seemed to stretch and fight against the pain. When the needle was out, he sat back, his breath shallow as he watched the cub's chest rise and fall in the rhythm of life, uncertain but still there. It was a fragile victory, the kind that made you wonder if it was worth celebrating or mourning. The road ahead wasn't clear, but one thing was certain. He wasn't leaving it behind. Eli sat back, staring at the cub as its tiny chest rose and fell, still shallow but steady. There was no sign of immediate relief, no sign that this little body would fight its way back from the brink. But for now, it was breathing, and that was all that mattered. The wind outside picked up again, its soft, distant howling almost a mirror to the quiet urgency inside. He could feel the weight of the mother's presence, even though she was still out on the porch, her breathing steady in the cold. She wasn't moving, but Eli knew she hadn't gone anywhere. Not yet. The room felt too small for the weight of it all. The cub's fragile life, the silence of the wilderness, and the ever-watchful gaze of the bear waiting just outside. Eli felt like he was holding his breath, like if he moved too quickly, the world might crack. The kind of stillness that stretches out, forces you to face every choice you've ever made. The big ones, the small ones, the ones that felt meaningless at the time, but now seem like the only things that matter. He took a deep breath, the air thick with the smell of pine, iodine, and sweat. The cub shifted slightly, its tiny body twitching under the blanket. Eli reached out, brushing a stray lock of fur from its face, his fingers trembling slightly. The small, wet nose twitched at the touch, and for the first time, the cub let out a small whimper, a sound that scraped against Eli's heart. Outside, the bear had begun to stir. The gentle creak of the porch boards echoed through the cabin, and for a split second, Eli froze, as if the movement of the mother was a signal he had missed. He glanced toward the window, but the shadows were deep, and the porch was empty, except for the barest imprint of her paws in the snow. She had moved. Eli stood slowly, taking care not to disturb the cub. It felt fragile, as if the slightest movement might shatter everything. But there was something else pulling him to the door, the same force that had guided him to open it in the first place. Something deeper than survival instinct, something tied to the stillness outside. He crossed the room quietly, his boots barely making a sound against the wooden floor. The bear was out there, waiting, her presence like a shadow hovering just out of reach. When he opened the door, the cold rushed in like an old memory, familiar and biting. The morning light had started to creep across the horizon, casting long shadows over the snow-covered ground. The bear was still there, her back to him now, but he could see the tension in her body. Every muscle was coiled, and her breath came in slow, measured pulls. She was watching something, the same thing Eli had felt earlier, but now it was real. It was the space between them, the distance that had always been there, like a wall built from years of survival. He stepped out onto the porch, his boots crunching softly in the snow. The air tasted like sharp pine and cold metal, and for a moment, Eli closed his eyes, breathing it in. He had never felt so caught between two worlds, the one he knew and the one that had just opened up in front of him. The wild world, where there were no promises, only the raw truth of what it took to survive. The bear didn't look at him immediately, but when she did, her eyes were different. She didn't seem angry or afraid or desperate anymore. She simply regarded him, as if he were nothing more than a small, curious creature in the vastness of the world she knew so well. Eli held her gaze, and something in him shifted. The pull of the wilderness was in her eyes, in the way she carried herself, in the way she had waited for him to make his choice. There was nothing to say, nothing that could explain the bond between them, the unspoken promise that had passed between them when she set the cub down on his porch. "You don't need to thank me," Eli whispered, though he knew she couldn't understand. He wasn't sure if he was saying it for her or for himself. He couldn't speak to her in words, but in some way, they had already spoken. The bear's head tilted slightly, as if considering him. She didn't make a sound, but she stepped forward, closing the distance between them. For a moment, Eli didn't move, frozen between instinct and understanding. The air was thick with the weight of this unspoken moment. Two creatures, so different, so far apart, but connected in a way that felt older than time itself. She took another step forward, her massive body so close now that Eli could feel the heat of her breath on his face. It was strange, almost unreal, the kind of stillness that filled the space with something sacred, something that couldn't be explained by words or rules. This was not a moment to rush, but a moment to simply be. The cub's faint cries from inside the cabin broke the silence, and the mother paused, her head turning toward the door. Her gaze lingered there for a long moment, and then she shifted her weight, as if making a choice. She moved away from him, her body rolling with the grace of a creature who had long known how to disappear into the wild. Eli took a step back, watching her every movement, feeling the pull of the wilderness tug at him. With a final glance, the bear disappeared into the forest, her shape swallowed by the trees, as if she had never been there at all. The silence that followed was profound, like the whole world had exhaled in unison, and Eli was left standing on the porch, his breath coming slower now. He didn't know what the future held for the cub, or for him for that matter. But one thing was certain. The choice he had made today had changed him. Something had shifted, something deep and irreversible. He had stepped into a world that wasn't his to control, but one that he could respect. Inside the cabin, the cub stirred again, its tiny body trembling in the warmth of the blankets. Eli took one last look toward the trees before stepping back inside, the door clicking shut behind him. The wildness, it seemed, had already begun to take root inside him, and he wasn't sure it would ever leave. Eli closed the door softly behind him, but the weight of it lingered, pressing down on his chest. The cabin, though small and familiar, now felt different, too quiet, too still. He glanced down at the cub, still tucked in the warmth of the blanket, its small chest rising and falling with a steady, though fragile, rhythm. It was still alive, and that was the only certainty he had. For now, that was enough. He moved quietly around the room, gathering the supplies he needed to finish what had been started. The cub's injury was still fresh, and he wasn't sure how long it could hold on without proper medical care. His eyes lingered on the small body again, his fingers hesitating over the bandages. I can't lose it. I can't fail this creature, he thought, though the weight of the thought almost crushed him. He had already stepped outside the world he knew, the world of rules, of boundaries, of procedures that could be written down in neat reports. Now, he was in a different world altogether, one where decisions were made in silence, in the quiet space between breaths. The silence of the room was punctuated only by the sound of his own breathing and the occasional soft shuffle from the cub. He had to keep moving, he reminded himself. He couldn't afford to freeze. His job wasn't just about protecting the land. It had always been about protecting what lived on it, too. But this wasn't part of the plan. This wasn't a routine rescue or an animal he could simply call in help for. This was a choice that would make him face something deeper than any protocol he had followed before. Eli finished wrapping the cub's wound, his hands careful and deliberate. He hadn't expected to find himself here, in this place where everything felt out of his control. The whole process was supposed to be mechanical, methodical. But the deeper he went into the task, the more he realized how human it all felt. Every movement, every decision, every breath. His hands shook slightly as he finished the last bandage, but the cub was quiet now, breathing more easily. The room was warm, but the chill of the early morning outside still clung to him. He had never felt more distant from the forest than he did now, as if it had already begun to slip away from him. He walked over to the window and pulled back the heavy curtain. The sky was lightening, the first traces of dawn creeping over the ridge. The snow was turning blue in the pale light, and the trees, those old, silent sentinels of the park, stood like dark shadows against the soft glow of the morning. And then he saw her, the bear. She was standing at the edge of the clearing again, still as ever, her eyes locked on the cabin. The world outside seemed to hold its breath. Eli's heart thudded in his chest, and for a moment, time stretched out again, and he was back at that first moment on the porch, the air cold, the silence deep, the choice clear. He knew she had never left. She hadn't gone anywhere. She had waited for him to make his move, to make his choice. And now, Here she was, standing as if nothing had changed, as if the world outside the cabin had never moved. Eli reached for his jacket, and then he paused, his fingers lingering over the zipper. He felt a strange pull to step outside again, to answer the quiet call that seemed to hang in the air. The wild had never felt so close. It was there just beyond the door, waiting for him to open it, waiting for him to step back into it. But he knew the cub wasn't ready. It needed more time. It needed safety. And yet, even as he thought it, Eli couldn't ignore the feeling that the wildness, that quiet pull, was something he could never truly leave behind. He shook off the thought, focusing on the task at hand. The cub was still breathing, still fighting, and that was all that mattered. For now, that was his world, the small, fragile life in the corner of the room. But part of him still felt the draw of the wilderness outside, the part of him that had always belonged to it, even when he hadn't known it, even when the job had made him forget. As the hours passed, Eli worked with a single-mindedness that only comes when you're faced with a moment that might be the last. He made sure the cub's bandages were secure, that it was fed and comfortable, that every little detail had been taken care of. When he finally sat down, exhaustion hit him in waves. His body ached from the tension, his mind from the weight of decisions that seemed too large for a single day. But still, the cub's tiny chest rose and fell, steady as ever, and that small victory felt like enough. As the sun rose higher in the sky, Eli stepped outside to gather more supplies. He needed to keep the cabin stocked in case of emergencies. More food, more tools, more first aid supplies. The air had warmed slightly, and the snow had a soft, glistening quality to it as the light touched it. He found his breath coming easier now, no longer caught in the tight grip of fear. But still, he kept one eye on the clearing. The mother bear was gone, but the feeling of her presence hadn't left him. It never really would. Eli gathered the supplies he needed, moving methodically, but his thoughts were still with the cub. Every moment, every step he took, seemed to bring him closer to something. It was a feeling he couldn't quite place. It was as if the decision he had made, the choice to help the cub, to risk so much, was somehow the beginning of something larger. Something that wasn't just about the survival of this small life. It was about understanding that sometimes, in the quiet of the wild, all you had was your choices. And those choices would either bind you to the world, or they would leave you standing in the dark, alone. When he returned to the cabin, the cub was still in its blanket, breathing a little more steadily now. Eli's heart gave a small, cautious beat of hope. The hardest part wasn't over, he knew. But this was a good start. He closed the door behind him and settled into the quiet again, listening to the sounds of the wilderness just beyond the window, to the quiet hum of the world outside. The weight of the bear's presence was still there, just out of reach, but it didn't matter. For now, it was just him and the cub, holding on to a fragile thread of life. And sometimes that was all you could do. The days that followed passed in a quiet rhythm, the kind that only the wild could offer. Eli didn't speak much, but his actions were loud in their own way. Each morning, he checked the cub's bandages. Each evening, he fed it milk with a steady hand. The cub grew stronger with every passing day, its small body gaining the strength it needed to fight its way back. It was slow, measured progress, just like everything in the wild. Nothing moved quickly out here. There were no guarantees, only the fight to stay alive. By the time the second week arrived, the cub was standing on wobbly legs, testing its balance with uncertain steps. Eli laughed quietly every time it stumbled, though the sound was more relief than amusement. "Easy there, champ," he whispered, crouching beside the cub as it wavered again, its little body tipping before it caught itself. The wound was healing. The limp remained, but it wasn't a permanent one. The cub's eyes were bright now, alert, its fur beginning to look less ragged, more like the wild creature it had always been meant to be. And as Eli sat with it by the fire, his thoughts always seemed to wander back to the mother bear, the one who had trusted him without a single word. He wondered where she was now, if she was still waiting. He would never truly know, but he couldn't help but feel that, somehow, the wildness had given him something in return for his choices. It wasn't a debt that could ever be repaid, but it was something deeper, a quiet understanding that sometimes the right thing to do wasn't always the safest thing. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the cabin was bathed in gold, Eli opened the door, the same way he had weeks ago. The world beyond the threshold was quiet, expectant. For a moment, the air hung still, as if holding its breath. Then, in the distance, he saw it, a shape moving through the trees. The mother bear. She was close now, much closer than before, and for a moment, Eli's heart caught in his throat. But this time, he wasn't afraid. He watched as she moved, her head held high, her gaze steady. And then, without a sound, she turned away, disappearing into the shadows of the trees. Eli stood at the door, watching her go, feeling the weight of everything that had passed. The world was still, but something had changed, something that no word could explain. He closed the door softly behind him, the sound of it barely a whisper. He turned back to the cub, still nestled by the fire. It was safe now, and for the first time in a long while, Eli believed that maybe, just maybe, the world was still full of second chances.